Hey, it is your buddy Peace and Harmony with you here today. We're zooming in and focusing in on a very important concept. Excuse me, I think I have the hiccups. A very important concept that is very important to be cognizant of and understand if you are healing through a relationship with a narcissist, emotionally manipulative abuser, a psychopath, someone who has taken advantage of your good nature. And this is called trauma bonding. It can also create something which is known as complex PTSD, complex post-traumatic stress syndrome. And this is different than, PTSD, like shell shock syndrome, what they might have equated to what, veterans have experienced as a result of being involved in acts of war, acts of violence. There's a distinguishing feature between the two, but they're very closely tied together and related together. So it's very important to understand and become cognizant of and aware of the presence of trauma bonding in your relationship, what it means for you, what it means historically for you, and what it means kind of moving forward and how to really move through it successfully. And you can see and understand the patterns in this, hopefully within yourself. And then with that awareness, you can then dissolve that sort of trauma bond and look at re-educating yourself using the concept of neuroplasticity to create some new neural pathways in your mind and get some new experiences going for yourself, new feelings for yourself, a new way of relating as part of your journey. And before we get started, I want to give a huge shout out to those of you who have recently donated to the channel. Particularly, we have an awesome viewer in the California area who's made a huge donation to the channel. Thank you so much for your recent donation. It's really going to help and inspire me to provide content here and relevancy and keep the ideas flowing. Thank you for your inspiration. My gratitude goes out to you. And yes, those of you who have had, some positive effects from the channel, please do feel free to donate. There is a button on the homepage of Peace and Harmony here, and it will help. I'm putting together a website for us, as well as some content, so you can refer to that as well, along with the book. So keep tuned, keep posted. I'll keep you updated with our progress. And I also want to get focused in right now on the topic of trauma bonding. A trauma bond was first delineated or explained by Patrick Carnes, who looked at the very strong relationship tie that was very indelible, very resistant to change, very akin to Stockholm Syndrome, where basically those people who have become abused begin then to kind of have a denaturing of their personality, their thought patterns, and their emotions, and can, begin to relate to an abuser, identify with the abuser as their captor, is really kind of their the one who is leading their life, or really their firm authority over their life. So Stockholm Syndrome was first discussed in a bank robbery, basically where bank robbers had, used guns and things of this nature to gun down people, and then they began to basically identify and agree with their abuser. Also, trauma bonding basically is set up, especially through repeated cycles of abuse, such as which are very strong patterns of intermittent positive and negative rewards. In other words, if you think of like a what is the word that I'm looking for? Like a slot machine mentality. So in other words, you're there for a little bit, and then you get some, you're ahead, and then they take all your money, and then you want to get your money back. So you begin to playing harder and harder and harder, and putting more and more coins into the slot machine. And then you're ahead, and then you lose it all, and then you want to get your losses back. In other words, that's called an intermittent reward cycle. It's very strong, and it's very resistant to change. So this is the exact experience that occurs in a trauma bonding relationship, where it's very resistant to change and then highly addictive. Resistant to change, in other words, it keeps people stuck. It keeps people in a very rigid, inflexible pattern where they can't step away and say, this is not good for me. I need to cut my losses now, and then skedaddle. It is a trauma bond, basically, where it happens through ongoing cycles of abuse. In other words, I know a lot of viewers who have had and experienced this through narcissistic or psychopathic parenting. In other words, the individual, the caretaker who is abusive to you, and then is disrupting that bond between an individual and their caregiver, which can be, between a parent and child, or if I almost think it's the same often in a spousal relationship or even with siblings, because there's a natural bond, kind of a cohabitation that should occur, a healthy bond, going through experiences together, discussing things in depth, celebrate life traditions together. There's a healthy bond there, and healthy feels healthy. This is very different from a trauma bond where there's ongoing cycles of intermittent abuse and then reward. Or, for example, especially when it comes to, like we said, the narcissistic parenting, constant criticism, yelling, fighting, slapping, taking advantage of your vulnerability, either as a child, not knowing better, needing to trust in authority, and then giving, your emotional growth, your personality growth, your perception of the world over to an abusive caretaker. So this disrupts the natural bond or ability to bond with your first role model in life. So your original pattern and then is kind of created there. Your original blueprint, your template, your design, your experience of the world at large begins in that first relationship and then is perpetuated and repeated through life. So in other words, what you experience at the home, you experience at school. And then what you experience at school, you then begin to re-experience through other stages of schools, your elementary, junior high, high school, and then your college, and then to your profession and your spouse. And so it becomes a real rigid pattern. If you have been abused as a child through a narcissistic or psychopathic abuser, this is called trauma bonding. And it creates a very strong emotional bond, basically, where then you then kind of seek out the same trauma bond in relationships. And it can be very, very destructive. The people who abuse you, lie to you, cheat, yell, all these are feelings of attack and then create that fight or flight. And then the woundedness becomes part of your day. And then you listen to music that reinforces that. And then, you might sleep poorly, eat poorly. You can't work. You don't have any friends. You don't have any healthy bonds to kind of learn from and feel from and experience from. So, the intermittent reward and punishment. So in other words, this can be done, as we're saying, with a parent, the parent who gives you, your clothing, the parent who gives you your food, who sends you up for school, who buys you your first pair of shoes, who teaches you how to eat. I mean, there's some rewarding behaviors there, correct? You need these to adapt. But what if this same caregiver is the one who is, slapping your face, hitting you with a belt, yelling constant criticisms, making internal references to the fact that you are, shameful, that you are an embarrassment because you're a child, because you happen to cry when natural things. In other words, they're not very nurturing. You stub your knee and they're upset at you, don't feel that, just get up. Make negative comments about your hair, your skin, how you are. They're not raising you up. They're basically raising you and beating you down at the same time. So this creates a trauma bond and is very resistant to change, and it tends to be repeated in cycles through life. And Patrick Carnes was the first to describe that, and especially when it's the misuse of fear, excitement, sexual feelings, this can also be repeated, especially in psychopathic relationships where they're intermittently, meaning not always. Intermittent means sometimes yes, sometimes not. You don't know if you're going to get it or not. You don't know, exactly what's in store, but you're going to, be waiting around for it. In other words, you become stuck and waiting for this higher state of sexual arousal or getting together or culminating the relationship or getting, the house together or, the car, house or car, whatever it is that you've planned, the vacation, this is, the positive. But then, then there are all sorts of strings attached, which are, combined with negative reinforcement, pathological lying, the setting up of a twisted emotional word salad that they will say that are very cryptic messages, things that you don't really get or understand, but that make you feel afraid. So then you have this fear combined with the sexual arousal or the promises, which are your positive rewards. So you get this very dangerous and lethal cocktail of reward and punishment. And, there's a lot of people who then their lives become dominated by this. They become aroused by abusal. And it's not too late to stop this. You have to recognize, by abuse. So they are then, you see the people, very sadomasochistic. I think that's a very common term, which you have to recognize in yourself, because eventually that will end up in hurt. It doesn't end up in pleasure. It ends up in pain. And then when the pain is great enough, you're like, this is really destroying me at the inner core, the inner fabric. My inner light is being shredded to pieces. So that is called trauma bonding, and it keeps people stuck. It's like a very, very super glue sort of relationship or adherence to this person, where then you're kind of identifying with the abuser, and you begin to let go or diminish your own authority, your own empowerment for sake of this. In other words, they begin to control and manipulate. Does it sound like something a covert narcissist or a psychopath would engage in, knowing that that's their personality disorder? Do you see how that it would cause you to, reinforce this, rememorize this through other situations, such as your job, such as your spending pattern, your eating pattern, your sleeping pattern? It begins a whole host of issues. So before we go too long, I just want you to recognize this as a situation which is called trauma bonding. It is very different from a healthy bond, which is what I'm encouraging and promoting you to seek and then get the tools to experience in life, which is not tinged and tainted with this repeated cycle of fear and love, abuse, neglect, and then validation, or, really where they're pulling your emotional strings, where you can't, experience kind of a true growth, where your life is lived out in the open. Oftentimes these individuals will take advantage of those by keeping everything secret, behind closed doors. Shh, don't tell anybody we're having this relationship. I mean, that's the oldest, narcissistic or psychopathic, manipulation in the book. Don't tell your kids, don't tell your boss, and then it becomes secretive. And then meanwhile, they're just taking advantage of the fact that you won't discuss it. You won't air it out. Do you see how then it becomes very isolating? Because then if you don't talk about it, do you see how they have you hook, line, and sinker? If you don't validate, have a sounding board with someone else, and then it becomes very ingrained, and they become very terrorizing for those people who are engaged in this, because it does become like a true psychological hijacking where, this whole combination of the stress hormones is going wild and you can't think clearly. People call it the fog, fragmented thought, attention deficit disorder. It becomes very chronic, ongoing. And so you really have to get away from that and kind of keep an eye out on the horizon for healthy relationships, where you're now able to, let go of that fear, let go of that trauma bond, be able to see it in how it's been reinforced or rehearsed and rememorized in your body, and then begin to let that go. And as I say in the quantum field, you become more energy than matter. So meaning, become just to engage in an energetic space, where a lot of people who have been trauma bonded, they really don't ever feel comfortable. They don't feel, at ease. They don't feel content. They don't feel a calm. They are very, run by the stress hormones, the adrenaline, I'm not good enough, the I'm nots, which are keeping the stress hormones in place. And that's not a way to live. They think you are, you're led to believe that this is a way to live through the stress hormones, never being good enough, constantly changing this, constantly trying to please here. You're never contented. You don't know life on just a contented, productive manner. And so you really need to understand the trauma bond, understand how it's perhaps set up some patterns, and then, let's get separate from it, and then let some of those feelings go, and understand that those belong to the category of trauma bond and are not what's going to help you experience life in the fullest and experience yourself, the great I am, and then follow up on your talents, your experiences. Because the prefrontal cortex, where you plan, think, judge, make decisions, is, then, the limbic brain, the feeling brain, the fear is overriding your ability to dream, to think, to plan, to follow up on it, to believe in yourself. So you need to kind of get out of that mode through reinforcement, i.e. keeping your appointment book, reinforcing yourself positively through the healing gift. I always recommend that you go out on your recovery date once a week, where you become this healed person. You really begin to seek and feel in real life what it feels like to be healthy again. Take yourself for an ice cream, a yogurt, a dinner, a lunch, where you're kind of not feeling afraid. Go to a painting gallery, go to a hardware store, go to a beautiful meadow, something where you can then be your whole self, and then give yourself a healing gift to reinforce what you have learned in those 2 hours. So an example of a healing gift, might be you get something like this that, is a reinforcement, follow your heart. If you can get a little something like this and put this in your house, your office, your workspace, your dream space, maybe you create a sacred space, getting a little something like this that reminds you of the love that you are, the wonderful person, magnificent person that you are. You need to do this once a week, because you need to have the reinforcements around you to keep you on track, and then to stimulate those new neural pathways that remind you. So that's why I recommend the affirmations. Writing, keeping at least one smiley face, even an emoji in your environment that reminds you to smile. People go through all day when they're in a trauma bond, scared, and their faces are scrunched like this, they're always like scared. They're, brushing their teeth, they're scared. They're driving, they're scared. They're constantly crunching their face. They're, you're being run by the hormones of stress. Let's use the role of metacognition and go, wow, I'm run too much by this. This is, I'm going to let this go. I'm going to now feed myself in my emotional real estate inside the feel good, the looking good, the hearing good, the sounding good, all what I call resensitization of the positive. So all the senses. So if you don't have your 5 senses mapped out on how you reinforce that positive feeling, sight, sound, movement, go out and then just stand erect, even if it's for 30 minutes. See how long you can really stand with dignity and stand with humility. See how long you can stand with gratitude. See how long you can go with listening to healing and calming music, 432 musics. Not the music that reinforces how trauma bonded or how fearful you have been and kind of gotten you in that mode. Begin to select and choose new kinds of music which are more uplifting and, can help create that internal flora or environment emotionally of soothing sounds, because energetically, when you become more energy than matter, sound is a vibration, and sound works, in the internal organs, and it gives them a positive, things. It gives them a positive way to kind of reset themselves. I mean, imagine if you're around, bullets firing, yells, screaming, fires, smoke, people running. I mean, that's a whole different feeling inside versus calm, soothing, beautiful, harmonious music. And then do you see how that'll affect your emotional body? And then that'll in turn affect all your internal organs, your thought process. It's all reinforcing. So you need to plug into those. A lot of people, if you think of, chanting, if you think of those crystal singing bowls, or people who play like healing gongs or things of that nature. Those are healing vibrations which will soak into your internal body and help you energetically to get more, congruent with your all your energy sources, and then begin to help release that sort of visual, envisioning for your future. So you need to, as I call it, resensitize yourself away from this trauma binding and then towards the healthy bond, where you can experience and celebrate things, and then reinforce this in your appointment book. So you're doing this, you have to consciously do this, put this in your book, and then reinforce it. And then, pretty soon, after a couple months, even a couple years, it'll become automatic. You become a whole new person, all because you followed and reinforced the resensitization, the retraining of yourself, and then experiencing of life on a whole much more satisfying and pleasing, filled with love and fulfillment level. It is like reinventing your internal core, which you can do when you use the tools. It is your buddy, Peace and Harmony, with you here today. I hope that these videos do help. Please share, please subscribe, and please donate for more great tools, videos, discussion, and support.